Hey guys, today I'm going to be talking about Resident Evil 7, or at least the demo that they released. I want to talk about why I think that it's important for like the horror genre, at least for games and stuff like that. What I want to talk about is why I think that it's important for the horror genre in terms of why it's actually going to make a return to being like scary, as a horror genre should be. This is, I was playing it and I was just kind of like, this is the first time I've actually been genuinely creeped out and kind of worried about being scared, or, like something actually legitimately scaring me for a long time when it comes to Resident Evil. And I mean, maybe this is just my experience, because the first Resident Evil game I really played and got into was Resident Evil 4, which wasn't like the original ones that were totally survival horror. It was a little bit more action-oriented with just kind of like a creepy atmosphere going on. But what I will say is that the reason I think Resident Evil 7 is important is because it's kind of bringing it back to the roots of horror as a base concept, rather than what it's been doing in the past. And what I mean by that is, you look at Resident Evil as a franchise. Even from the very first game, it was kind of outlandish in nature for the kind of horror that it was. Like, yes, it was creepy, and it was survival horror. It tried to freak you out, and it made you feel kind of powerless and weak, because you could fight the zombies, but you weren't very competent at it, and it was hard to run away. So, any encounter with a zombie was difficult and challenging, and so therefore kind of intense and pulse pounding, and that's kind of what made it scary. Couple that with the lack of supplies and the fact that it's just not easy to fight the zombies, and you're more about trying to avoid them and solve puzzles and just survive. That's why it's survival horror. But it was outlandish in the sense that the setting was fictional. You were outside of a fictional city in a mansion. So already it was a little bit more than what most people experience in their daily lives, like a mansion. It's still a home, but not one anybody normally lives in or even might see in their lifetime. And then you were dealing with zombies, which at the time were not as overdone as they are now, so you could get away with making them creepy and scary, but they were still zombies. And so there was an inherent level of like, well, I would never have to deal with this in my real life, so it's not that scary, because I'm never going to have to worry about a zombie attacking me or anybody I know, because they don't legitimately exist. And so, in a way, even from the very first game in the franchise, they were kind of out there. But what I've found is that they continued to get more outlandish with each game. Resident Evil 2, I think I know the least about. I just know that that's where characters like Leon and Ada, I don't remember, I just know it's where a few of the major characters of the franchise have originated from. But I know that by Resident Evil 3, you had things like Nemesis, which were, obviously completely different, not a zombie, but like a bio-weapon, a bioorganic weapon. And from there, like, Umbrella just went off rails and started making a ton of different creatures and stuff like that. Even Resident Evil 4, they kind of brought it back at the beginning of the game, and you were just fighting these villagers, and it was a little bit more grounded. And then they started going with the parasites, and then by the end of the game, fucking Sadler was whatever the fuck Sadler turned into. I don't even know what you call that thing, but obviously, the series has gotten more outlandish and action-oriented as time has gone on, which of course is annoying to a lot of long-time fans. So, the demo for Resident Evil 7 is already kind of important, at least to the franchise itself, because it's kind of signaling a return to the roots of being creepy and kind of survival horror-y. The problem is that survival horror, of course, has changed in and of itself as a genre since the time that Resident Evil 1 came out. Resident Evil 1 came out in, the 90s? 1996 is when Resident Evil, the original, came out. So obviously, survival horror has changed since then. It's not the same kind of game anymore. Survival horror games nowadays are more like Amnesia and Soma. I know those are both made by the same company, so of course they're going to be similar to each other, but it's going to be, games like that. PT obviously was a big thing when it came out, and unfortunately Silent Hills got canceled, as has Allison Road at this point. So the only game similar in nature to what PT was going for in terms of atmosphere and design style aesthetic, I guess you could call it, would be Visage. That's pretty much all that's left. And now, Resident Evil 7, if it follows in the pattern of the demo, it's going to be a similar kind of, I think, experience. And so here's the thing. The reason I think that it's so important for the horror genre in general, not just the franchise in and of itself, but the horror genre of gaming, is because, first of all, Resident Evil is a seminal franchise. You know, it was like the go-to survival horror franchise for a while there. And it kind of jump-started the genre. Like, before that, there were some games like it, but not a whole lot. It kind of put that genre of game on the map for developers, for everybody. And so, since then, I think all the growth and change we've seen in the survival horror genre came about because of Resident Evil. In fact, let me look. The other really big survival horror series was Silent Hill. And Silent Hill, I don't care about the movie, I want the game. The games. Came out in 1999. So 3 years after the original Resident Evil came out was when Silent Hill initially came out. So obviously, you know, Resident Evil inspired a large spike, so to speak, in the not Silent Hill genre, the survival horror genre. There we go. So anyway, the reason I think it's important, as I've said several times, finally getting to the point, is it's bringing things back to a realistic standpoint for horror. The reason that's important, I am going to kind of go into psychology here a little bit and talk about the psychology of horror and why it works and why some things work and some things don't work now. As I mentioned earlier, the whole zombie thing has been kind of played out. You know, it's gotten to the point where zombies became so prevalent in movies, video games, all sorts of media, that we had to branch out into other genres that zombies don't really belong in order to continue making profitable, in order to keep making profitable zombie merchandise. You know, like we have movies like Zombieland and what's that other one that I was going to talk about? I forget what it's called, but it's a romance movie involving a zombie and a girl. It's cold body thing. Warm Bodies? Is that what it's called? Yeah, Warm Bodies. It's a romance movie about a zombie. And so that's the thing, is like zombies became so played out that in order to keep making profitable movies about them, they started branching out into genres they don't belong in, like comedy and romance and stuff like that, when they were originally genuinely a horror trope. They belonged to horror, and that's where they should have stayed, because the whole idea of a zombie should be inherently scary. But here's why it stopped being scary. Here's the psychology of horror bit. The whole premise of exposure therapy is exactly why zombies became not scary anymore. When you have a phobia or a fear of anything, therapists employ, in most cases, exposure therapy, which literally means they make you face whatever it is you fear repeatedly until it becomes mundane to you. If you're an arachnophobe and you're afraid of spiders, if you were to get a job as a spider exterminator and stuck with it and really actually did that job well, after about a month and a half, you wouldn't be afraid of spiders anymore, because they would become a daily aspect of your life. Day in and day out, you have to deal with spiders, so they don't scare you anymore. And that's because the base root of fear is the lack of knowledge or understanding of something. And that's the thing, is you can read about, say, spiders online. You can Google them, you can read all about all kinds of spiders, what they're like, what they look like, all that stuff. But on a subconscious level, the human mind values experience over anything. And that's the difference between being textbook smart of something and street smart of something. When people use those phrases, what they're talking about is somebody who's only read about it and somebody who's actually done it. And part of that also is because fear at a base level, along with this lack of knowledge, is a lack of confidence in yourself with being able to handle it. In a way, fear is sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy where you are afraid you won't be able to handle something, and so you can't, because of that fear. With experience comes confidence, and if you're confident in yourself that you can deal with whatever's in front of you, you won't be afraid of it. So these two things coupled together on a base subconscious level is what causes fear to have the power over people that it does. And the reason this is important to Resident Evil 7 is because they're going to be utilizing, it seems like, more realistic horror than they have in the past. The reason PT worked and was so scary wasn't just because it was well made, it wasn't just because it had good atmosphere and built dread properly, it was also because a lot of its horror was based in reality. Or at least things that have a tenuous link to reality. For example, the only supernatural aspect of the Resident Evil 7 demo that we are aware of so far is a ghost girl. What was scary about PT? A ghost girl. Why? Because ghosts and zombies are inherently different. You would think, okay, they're both supernatural horror, so why are zombies any different than ghosts? They're both, like, supernatural in the sense that you probably, most people don't exist in zombies. What the fuck am I talking about? Most people don't believe in zombies, and most people don't believe in ghosts. But the thing is, there's an inherently larger proportion of the population who believes in ghosts that don't believe in zombies. Why? Because zombies are like this physical thing. They are literally a dead body returned to life. Or, in more contemporary works, zombies have kind of just become known as infected. They have some sort of disease that makes them act like a traditional zombie, but they're not actually undead. Either way, though, none of those things actually exist in real life as far as we know, and we've never encountered them. So they don't really particularly scare us at all. Ghosts, however, are in this weird gray area where it's like there are people who say they, explicitly 100% cannot exist, and then there are other people who say, well, we don't know, and then there are people who just outright believe in them. But there's still this doubt, this underlying doubt about ghosts. At least, like I said, there are going to be certain people who 100% no, ghosts don't exist. But there are going to be some people who do believe that ghosts exist or are in doubt about them. Personally, I'm one of the in doubt people. You know what I mean? I question it. I don't feel like there's enough evidence to say definitively, yeah, no, ghosts can't possibly exist. That's completely insane and will never happen or doesn't work. You know what I mean? Stuff like that, I can't say. I can't say they do exist. I can't say they don't. I've had no personal experiences with, like, ghosts. But I can't say either way. So I'm a doubt person, okay? I'm not going to definitively say yes or no. But that's why it can be scary. Because along with this realistic horror that they've got going on with this inherently creepy derelict house, which, again, sorry, I'm paranoid now. I just played this horror game demo that creeped me out. That's the problem. I'm going to be paranoid walking around my house for like 3 days. Anyway, and there's nothing inherently supernatural creepy about it, but it's decrepit and old, so disrepair, which for whatever reason already makes it creepy. There's shit everywhere, which, for a lot of people I think might make them just inherently on edge because of the fact that it's not neat and clean, especially people like me who can deal with a little bit of clutter, but not a ton, not the way that it's dirty in that house. And then there's, they're playing on the realistic creepiness that's been present in all the Resident Evil games with the gore. There's definitely a lot more, and I mean, they've downplayed it in comparison to other Resident Evil entries, which is good, but there's still, gore going on, but it's, again, realistic gore. It's not like people's heads popping off and blood everywhere. There's just the right amount of blood, and there's, like, bags in the fridge that you can't really place your finger on what's in them, but it looks organic. Same thing with in the pot of food in the VHS tape section. There's, like, fucking guts and shit in there, and you're just like, oh. And then in the room where you get the bolt cutters, there's, like, the cow or horse carcasses, whatever those are. So there's the realistic gore going on, not outlandish, over-the-top gore, but the kind that if you saw in real life, you'd be grossed out and be like, oh, this is not okay. And then even the few jump scares that they do have, like the doll falling and the mannequins that fucking follow you around and shit, realistic in the sense that you don't know why they moved or how those things are happening, but there's nothing inherently supernatural about it. And so that's really what I think put me on edge and made me creeped out. But that's the thing, is like they're linking this realistic horror with the gore and things popping up and moving around in ways that you can't really describe or understand right away, but you can't outright say that it is or isn't something. And the supernatural horror with the ghost girl and the fact that the house might be haunted. And that's the thing, is they're going back to, again, the base root of fear being you don't understand. You're given very little information. You don't even know who these characters are. They're not anything you're familiar with. And even the developers have said that the characters aren't going to be in the original game. And that's the other thing too, is like, going back to talking about how the series was outlandish to begin with. Like I said, even in the very first entry, you're outside of a fictional city in a mansion. Apparently, there's clues that this particular game is going to take place in Louisiana, specifically according to some coordinates that were found in a place called Transylvania, Louisiana, or close to it. Now, it might be a fictional city in Louisiana for all we know, but obviously, if it's taking place in a real location, already it's kind of linking itself to the real world, which is going to put you more on edge. Because if you're creating horror in a completely fictional location with completely fictional creatures, you can make it creepy using just atmosphere and stuff, but people are going to have this inherent disconnect because it's not related to anything in real life that they would find themselves afraid of. But when you put the player in a dark house that looks like a house anybody could live in, and one that most people would probably be somewhat familiar with, and it's dark, it's dirty, it's got all sorts of noises and underlying like atmospheric sounds that are creepy, and you give them no backstory whatsoever, barely any idea of who they are or what they're doing or why they're there, or even where this house is located, and you end up with a recipe for a great horror experience. Because again, we're going back to things people are familiar with, but you're injecting that fear of the unknown into it. For lack of a better word, they're attacking what you know. And that's really what I think it is too. So basically, the main points are like the realistic horror, using supernatural horror sparingly and in a way where it's a sort of supernatural horror where you're not 100% familiar with it, or like there's doubt in whether it's real or not. I didn't even know that was on. My scroll lock was on this whole time, and I looked over and there's just this light, and you're just like, what? And I never have scroll lock on, so I didn't even know what light that was. I kind of looked at it, and I was like, that's an S. Oh, scroll lock. I don't even know how that got activated. But anyway, so yeah, you end up with this sort of horror where it's like realistic in the sense that it's primarily grounded in reality and utilizes things to creep you out and make you uncomfortable that you could feasibly find in real life and would also be creeped out by in real life if you saw it with your own eyes. Sparingly using the supernatural horror in a way that they're utilizing, like I said, a ghost girl, which has been creepy recently, and the reason ghosts continue to be creepy is because there's this underlying doubt of whether they may or may not exist. And, even if you're a staunch believer that they don't exist, in the general community of people, in humanity in general, there's always going to be this doubt of whether they do or don't exist. We've never been able to definitively prove. Even scientists say that they can't prove that a soul does not exist. I remember, this might just be a TV show thing, this might be completely fake, and I've not researched it at all, but I remember in an episode of Breaking Bad, they were talking about whether the soul exists or not, and even after they took the chemistry approach and calculated every single thing in a human body, they still found a certain percentage that was of the human body that was unaccounted for. And I think there was an actual scientific thing done at one point where they said, straight up, like, okay, we weighed this body before and after death, and even after checking everything, there's this certain amount of weight that leaves the human body after they die that we can't account for. We have no idea what it's attached to or what's changing. And scientifically speaking, there's just this random unaccounted for amount of mass that leaves a human body when it dies. So even if you're the staunchest believer in science and are just like, no, ghosts cannot exist, it doesn't happen, then there's still always going to be, even in science, this unaccounted for doubt of whether ghosts exist or not. So there's always going to be an inherent fear of like, well, maybe this could happen, which is why they're smart that they're doing ghosts, so to speak, is because that form of supernatural horror hasn't been done recently, so it's not overplayed, and it's got that inherent doubt even in people who disbelieve in it. And so by using this realistic horror coupled with a slight supernatural horror, sparing use of it, and then kind of return to atmosphere, sound design, and, the basic things that make human beings freaked out just on a base inherent level, that's what's making Resident Evil 7, at least the demo that we have so far, work as a horror experience. Now, on top of that also is the fact that it is Resident Evil in and of itself. It would have been an important thing if, PT became Silent Hills, and Silent Hills carried on that tradition of survival horror and carried on what PT had started in a similar vein and lived up to it. That would have been important, but again, Silent Hill is admittedly, while generally better as a survival horror franchise than Resident Evil has become, less well known. So the fact that Resident Evil, the seminal, premier, silent, fucking wrong word, damn it, Resident Evil, the, premier, seminal survival horror franchise is doing this and going back to roots and everything is going to be important. Because of the fact that if they pull it off, and it goes back to what people want Resident Evil to make, it's obviously never going to be exactly as it was, but what they expect it to be, and it, it hits all the marks, and it sells well, and it gets good reviews, and everybody loves it, it's going to mark a traditional, a change in tradition of survival horror, because again, a lot of the industry is follow the leader and, do what's popular, and if Resident Evil popularized the survival horror genre, then redefining it again and becoming popular and leading the way once again is going to be a really big thing.